Nazi Germany, the one state that virtually everyone agrees is terrible. Adolf Hitler, the one man that virtually everyone agrees is evil. No matter where you were born, what country you're from, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're politics, everyone agrees that he's evil. Well, basically everyone. And if there's ever someone you don't like or a movement you don't really agree with, call the founder a Nazi and they instantly lose credibility. But if you call someone an Imperial Hirohitist, they'll just look at you funny. Dude, what are you talking about? I'm talking about Imperial Japan during World War II, a nation that committed atrocities just like Germany, and potentially even worse. Their military murdered prisoners or kept Korean women to comfort them. They raped hundreds of thousands of girls and would freeze babies alive or dissect babies alive in human medical experiments. Yet nobody even knows the name of the prime minister who took them to war, Hideki Tojo. If I was a betting man, I would say 99% of you have never heard of that name before. And before I started researching this video, I was with all of you too. Oh, and what about the Emperor of Japan? Well, he got shown up for being short by the American Pacific General, but he got to continue his reign until 1989, only stopping there because he died. Hey all, I'm your host Dylan, and today I just want to know how Japan was able to escape World War II with its nation intact, with most war criminals still in power, and a troubling history that most of us have forgotten. I'll look at the research, the data, and the statistics while keeping my biases out as much as possible. First, we'll look at the forgotten atrocities, then different experiences of forgiveness between Germany and Japan, then the effect of popularity, then radical transformation, and lastly, the Cold War implications. And as is a tradition on this channel, if you catch any mistakes I make in this video, leave a comment down below, and I'll correct myself in the pinned comment right down there. First, we have to go over the Pacific Theater of World War II. In this theater, Japan was directly responsible for 30 million deaths. For a good comparison, Germany was the direct cause of 13 million deaths, and that number includes all 6 million deaths from the Holocaust. However, even worse is that this number doesn't include what they did to people before they were killed. Starting with the event known literally as the Rape of Nanking, a period that lasted about a year, but through the first 6 weeks were insane. One time, 2 officers engaged in a competition to see who could behead 100 people the fastest. Or another time, when 20,000 Chinese civilians and soldiers were marched to the Yangtze River before being mowed down with a machine gun and then disposed of in the river. One of the officers at the massacre wrote about this time in a diary, saying, "I figured that I'd never get another chance like this, so I stabbed 30 of the damn Chinese. Climbing atop the mountain of corpses, I felt like a real devil slayer, stabbing again and again with all my might. Ugh, ugh," the Chinese groaned. There were old folks as well as kids, but we killed the lock, stock, and barrel. I also borrowed a buddy's sword and tried to decapitate some. I've never experienced anything so unusual. That's a pretty crazy diary to have about such a terrible event. And of course, as in the name, rape was extremely common. It wasn't uncommon for a girl as young as 9 or 10, or sometimes even younger, to be assigned to 20 men for repeated rape and then killed afterwards. Part of which we know from a German businessman who was part of the Nazi Party, who wrote back to Berlin about the terror and became the chairman of the committee for the Nanking safety zone to shelter roughly 250,000 Chinese citizens from the terror. Yes, a man who was part of the Nazi Party, the reason for 6 million Jews being killed, was the chairman of safety for 250,000 Chinese citizens. But then we move on to projects that might be able to compete with the terror the Japanese inflicted on Nanjing. In 1935, the infamous Unit 731 was set up. Unit 731 was a research lab where Japanese scientists did some of the least humane experiments on people ever conducted. Experiments like forcefully impregnating a woman, then infecting her with disease to see how they would transmit to the fetus. Or cutting off the limb, like an arm, and to reattach it somewhere else on the body. Or how about infecting someone with the flu, then dissecting them alive with no anesthesia in order to see the organs and how they reacted. Yeah, some truly horrific things. Or how about when they use subjects, usually strapped in place, to test plague bombs of infected fleas, which would then go on to be used against Chinese cities, killing up to 500,000 civilians. Another case involved a frostbite experiment on an infant born just 3 days prior, while another used POWs to test different grenades and flamethrowers. No one survived. When the Soviets and the Americans were closing in on the location, they killed every single prisoner and hid the bones of victims to evade detection. Oh, and did I mention that the American government hid this whole project from the public so that informants would work with the government to give the US their biological research? Thought I should add that in too. Now we should move on to the hundreds of thousands of mostly Korean women that were forced into sexual slavery. The system was set up because, according to Japanese officers, without comfort women, Japanese soldiers would go rape crazy, and the Japanese army needed to stop more rapes of Nanjing for PR purposes. Now isn't that just insane? Referred literally as public toilets by the Japanese, comfort women were obtained from Japanese volunteers, kidnappings from fake work applications, and just general kidnapping by local governments in places like China and Korea. Now probably the most damning thing is that none of these atrocities were ever dealt with in the Tokyo war crimes trial, as rape was not viewed as a war crime. This has only been recently changed too, with rape being officially designated as a war crime by the UN in 2008. And before you get too giddy, just don't look at what country was preventing rape from being a war crime for so long. Now, it wasn't uncommon for a woman, or a girl in many cases, to comfort 12 men a day, up to 30 during extremely busy times. Forced medical exams were constant, and physical violence was allowed if they resisted. The following are testimonies from 3 survivors of comfort houses. They came one after another. There was no end. Even now, I cannot forget. It lives inside me. I was only a child. I didn't even know what was happening to me. Alright, but let's say you weren't a woman, and instead you were a captured soldier. If you couldn't tell already, you weren't going to be in a great spot. Those who made it to prison camps endured some of the harshest and deadliest conditions of any prison camp during modern history, possibly even world history. If you were a POW in an American camp, there was about a 0.1 to 0.3% chance you'd die. Not bad if you ask me. Germany was different, with a 4% death rate for any Western POW, but because Slavs were racially inferior, they suffered a far higher death rate, around 50%. But if you were a Chinese POW, like 80% of Japanese POWs were, you had a death rate of 80%, which, for comparison, is about the same death rate as inhaling anthrax, and a similar death rate as the diseases that wiped out 80 to 90% of the populations of the New World during colonization. This was all part of the Japanese war psyche. Be brutal and never back down. Less than 1% of Japanese soldiers ever surrendered, or even captured, either fighting to their death or committing suicide. This was even true for civilians, who were told that Americans would torture and rape them, so instead, mothers and children would jump off cliffs or murder themselves in other ways. American POWs were treated better, but that wasn't really saying much. But for higher ranking soldiers with information, Japanese commanders would torture them endlessly, telling each prisoner, not soldier, but fellow English prisoners, to punch that person in the face or hold heavy items over their heads for hours. Telling each other English prisoner, not necessarily a soldier, get up in a line and punch that person in the face time and time again. Or, if that seemed a little too mean, instead, hold 50 pounds above your head for 3 hours straight. After that, if you survived, leaked documents found that Japan was planning on murdering every single Allied POW in the country, which only changed after atomic bombs were dropped on the country. But once Japan did surrender after 2 atomic bombs were dropped, the country got a very different treatment than Germany. Germany had to pay for everything that they had done, but Japan, just forgive them and move on. The top leaders of Germany were hunted down and prevented from committing suicide, and forcefully placed in documented trials in front of the entire world to see. Their crimes and acts are shown to the whole world before being sentenced to death. and potentially even more important, symbols and sympathizers of Hitler and the regime are not only shamed in Germany, but largely banned. Parties that, while of course subjective, even come off as being far right, are incredibly shamed with the entire political establishment coming after them. Now, it's unfair to act like Japan didn't have any consequences at all. They did have a trial that racked up a body count of 7, which included the Prime Minister, and they were fully occupied by the US for 7 years and forced to make a constitution that virtually prevented them from ever having a respectable military. But war criminals got to start a new life after terrible atrocities. Most famously is Mushorio Watanabe, who tortured thousands of American POWs and was listed as one of the most wanted people in the world after Japan's surrender, but then became an insurance worker a few years later, dying at the age of 85 with no form of punishment. However, he didn't leave the earth without giving us an interview in 1998 about his past.
Even among the Japanese, he was disliked. He was hated by all NCO in Omori, Japanese NCO.
Why?
Why? No question. He was so violent.
This is Mutsuhiro Watanabe.
ビート、血訓っていうのは白人社会においては非常な仕打ちだと。殴ったりピートしたりする程度のものは共同生活の中でやむを得ない場合もあったわけです。
So if the Prime Minister had to go, did the Emperor as well? Well, we talked about earlier. No, he went off scot-free. General MacArthur claimed he was being pragmatic about it, saying that if the US did anything to the Emperor, then Japan would explode, as the Emperor was divine and a descendant of the goddess Amaterasu of the sun, until he coincidentally renounced his claim of divinity in 1946. And in 1978, he got to meet the president, have a White House dinner, and go to Disneyland. And these things didn't sit right with many Americans, especially veterans who saw many of their friends and fellow Americans die, and in at least part due to the Emperor. Now compare this to the country of Germany, whose leaders never got to make it to 1975 for a friendship visit in the first place, and whose closest equivalent to the Emperor, Hitler, would have never been able to visit the US after what he and the country did, and likely wouldn't have made it past a few months, let alone 4 decades. Germany has memorials for all the European Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. Japan has memorials for the fallen veterans of World War II, including the war criminals. And this was all, at least in part, intentional. Allied forces wouldn't let the American public have a positive or even apathetic view towards Germany. Camps were filmed with their gas chambers. Skulls and graves, witnesses, and first-hand survivors were recorded and published widely. The Nuremberg trials were published for all to see. There was a different path for Japanese atrocities. There was never any filming of the terrible camps, never any witnesses that were punished by the governments, and never a widespread trial that made news headlines. This left a national memory, where Americans think of Pearl Harbor and the terrible surprise attack by Japan, and how they ended the war by dropping nukes on Japan, and then stopped there. Racism was sadly a huge part of the reason why. For your average American, they could not tell the difference between a Chinese soldier and a Japanese soldier. And it didn't help when the media and newspapers just lumped all East Asians into one group as Orientals. Because of the lack of Asian heritage in the US, and the fact that the president put nearly all Japanese Americans in internment camps, Americans just didn't feel the same attachment to the atrocities committed against Asians as they did Europeans. Until the 90s, Americans had never even heard of Unit 731. When the Rape of Nanking was published in 1997, it felt shocking because it was. They had never heard about it. Think about that for a moment. Americans were never taught about an event so violent in school or by the news. While at the same time, the Holocaust became nearly as central to World War II teaching as the actual battles between nations. And in many places became more central than the battles. You'll spend a month on the Holocaust, but just an hour on the entire Japanese theater of the war. Everyone knew about Auschwitz, but no one knew about Nanjing. And that leads us to nuclear sympathy, which helped Japan pull off a rare transformation from brutal empire to global victim. In August 1945, the US dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. First on Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. Tens of thousands of people died instantly, and tens of thousands more suffered and died from radiation in the weeks following. These truly changed everything. These 2 bombs made a population go from fighting in the jungle for decades because surrendering was cowardly to a nation of pacifism, sympathy, and global horror in a different way. The sights of people being evaporated, entire cities gone, and nuclear radiation transferring cancer and lifelong crippling diseases to children allowed for the nation that was once seen as the most brutal in the entire industrial world to also be the first and still, thankfully, only casualty of the nuclear era. And Japan leaned into that, leaning in as a way to change their identity and reputation. Once the US occupation ended, the Japanese government built a national identity around peace and memorializing. Every August, Hiroshima hosts a solemn ceremony with speeches, lanterns, and doves. It's treated as a uniquely tragic event in world history, and it overshadows everything Japan did before 1945. Even foreign leaders from surrounding Asian nations follow along. Many in those foreign governments are enraged at the rug sweeping of these horrors, but they still go along with it. This has bled into the mind of Japanese citizens too. Surveys show surprisingly high levels of ignorance and low levels of introspectiveness about the events that took place during the conquests of Imperial Japan. And like I was hinting at earlier, Practicality was eating up American plans of reform, justice, and retribution. The US absolutely planned for Japan to follow a similar path as Germany, but with the threat of the Soviet Union and the especially intense border splitting between the 2 Koreas, priorities switched from justice to politics. The US needed Japan as an ally against communism. General MacArthur and the president decided to protect the emperor, fast-track economic recovery, and stop arresting new war criminals. In 1948, the US halted additional prosecutions altogether. And by the early 50s, most prisoners were paroled, and behind the scenes, the US struck deals that would have been unthinkable in Europe. The Unit 731 scientists got immunity. The general who ran the unit was never punished, and many of the staff went on to become professors, researchers, and respected doctors. The emperor was shielded, and in 1951, a treaty forgave most reparations. And a year later, a security pact made Japan a key American ally. Purged war criminals quietly returned to power. Men who'd overseen slave labor and war campaigns now ran ministries and banks. The world saw Japan as the land of Toyotas and Walkmans, as memories faded of the atrocities committed before. The US helped shape the new Japanese government, economy, and the version of history that was taught. Japan's national broadcaster issued textbook guidelines that forbade the phrase Rape of Nanking. It was part of a decades-long battle over how the war should be remembered. And like I said earlier, when it came to reparations, the official Japanese position was that all claims had been settled in 1951. Countries like South Korea and China argued that war crimes, especially sex slavery, couldn't be waived by treaty. In 1993, Japan did finally issue an apology, the Kono Statement, but it's been a political flashpoint ever since. Some Japanese leaders have walked it back, and others have tried to erase it entirely. A 2023 poll found that only 4% of Japanese under 30 had a correct estimate of the Nanking death toll. Slavery is another event that is heavily covered in American history classes, but world history slavery isn't covered all that much. Modern world slavery, not even a thought about it. No way it really exists. There's actually surprising evidence that the stereotypical Muslim countries have a system in place that is slavery in all but name. You can check that out right here. And don't forget to learn from the past, hold Japan accountable, and think controversy. I'll catch you over in this video right here.